Oh, well, welcome everybody. And I am Professor Kathy Bowrey. I'm at the School of Law, Society and Criminology at the Faculty of Law and Justice at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. And along with Professor Eva Hemmings-Burton, who's the Professor of Mediated Culture at the Department of Culture and Society at Linköping University, I'm also the co-director of the International Society for the History and Theory of IP, or ISHTIP as we call it. For those of you who haven't heard of ISHTIP, this is an international society that began in about 2008 to grow interdisciplinary thinking about the phenomenon of IP and its history, and in particular to encourage an exchange of ideas about methods thinking between humanities and law. And our main activity is a workshop which is held in different locations every year. And our next workshop is about the themes Machines of Law and Intellectual Property as Legal Machinery. And that's going to be held in person and virtually. It's a hybrid event on the 20th to the 22nd of June, hosted by the Department of Law at the University of Gothenburg. And if you're interested in attending, you can register at any time from now up until the 10th of June. And let me just post a link for that so I don't forget. Okay, so today I'm looking forward to a chat about a fantastic book that has been recently published by Harvard University Press, Paris to New York, the Transatlantic Fashion Industry in the 20th Century. It's written by Professor Véronique Pouillard, who's a Professor of International History at the University of Oslo. And we have two great discussants today, Stina Teilman-Lock, who's an Associate Professor at the Department of Management, Politics and Philosophy at Copenhagen Business School, and Johanna Gibson, who's the Herschel Smith Professor of Intellectual Property and the Deputy Director of Queen Mary Intellectual Property Research Institute at the Centre for Commercial Law at the School of Law at Queen Mary, University of London. So the format today will be that we'll hear from Véronique, who's going to introduce her book, and then we'll go to Stina and to Johanna for their comments, and then we'll go back to Véronique to respond, and then we will open up the floor for general discussion. If you would like to comment, please put your hand up or post in the chat, and I'll either call on you in person, or if you prefer, I can read your comment for you. I've really enjoyed reading Véronique's book, and I really look forward to hearing more from all of you. So I think I'll go over to you, Véronique.
Hello, and thank you, Kathy, Stina, and Johanna for this invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here as part of the ISHTIP talks. So what I propose to do now is to, as Kathy suggested, introduce the book. And I would like to do three things. The first one being to briefly introduce the generalities in the book, general background. A second thing will be to show the three threads in the book that are enterprises, entrepreneurs and designers, and then innovation and intellectual property, the third thread. And then I will go on with intellectual property indeed, which is at the center of our conversation today. I will, I think, share screen because I would like also to show you some images. Let's see if this works. I should put it full screen instead. There we go. Voila. Here we go. You should see this full screen now. So this book is indeed based on the work on these two cities that you can, of course, see here. These two cities are paradigmatic, but they're not unique to the industry. We could really imagine a completely symmetric book with different cities. We can think about Milan, London, closer to us, Tokyo, Lagos, Shanghai, and so forth, right? So what I want to outline here is that this book is really about the relation between two fashion cities, but it is not necessarily unique. Paris to New York is also Paris and New York. It's a book about the collaboration, about work together of these two cities. And it's also between Paris and New York. It's also what happens in between, with the strong idea that fashion happens indeed between the two cities. And the book starts with the idea that if we want to understand how the fashion industry became what it is today, it's an extremely powerful industry, 2% roughly of GDP, trillions produced in value. If we want to understand how the fashion industry became what it is today, it's a good idea to look back. And looking back, the idea was also to think we have such powerful images, we have such powerful brands and brand value, and how did we get there? And in order to look at that, I just tried to get a little bit away from these images and to look at entrepreneurs, at institutions, and at intellectual property. Entrepreneurs, I'll go rather fast on this. But just to say as preliminary remark that what we find here is many, but not only, women entrepreneurs. And these women entrepreneurs also had somehow a fluctuating place. And it changes along with time. Women take prominent places in some eras, and then women seem to somehow recede as entrepreneurs in different times. Even recently, we see that there's a lack of women CEO in the profession, which is preoccupying. So of course, this means also that this is an entry point to discuss gender and intellectual property. And I know that several people present today have a keen interest into that question. The size of the firms, well, I just put this graph up, which is about the beginning of the book. We have very small and indeed very large firms, a tendency to concentration, which is also important for us thinking about intellectual property. And then in the book is also the history of the attempts to launch international firms, for Paris firms to go to the United States. How they fail, how they succeed is also part of the history I trace in the book. I'm very interested, generally speaking, in my research in the relation between business and government. That's also something I wish to pursue, and it can be, of course, elusive. But here in the case of fashion, there's a lot interesting to look at. The place of governments. Fashion thrives where governments are helping it to live. The state in France, and in the case of New York, rather city governments. There are also other institutions involved, association of fashion professionals, that somehow play the role that in other industries, in other creative industries, is the role of authors' rights societies. There's no, so to speak, authors' rights societies for fashion, but for fashion we have a Chambre syndicale de la couture, we have a Fashion Originators Guild of America, and these to some extent play the role of authors' rights societies. They protect authors' rights. Here we see in the middle an accounting sheet of the French Chambre syndicale, and among these we see the money made by counterfeiting lawsuits, of which I'll talk a little bit more today. Institutions are also, of course, the courts. Here you have the Supreme Court of the State of New York in this picture, which plays a role in the story of the book. And then we have also, of course, the associations of workers and unions that are extremely important in shaping work in the industry, in shaping changes in the industry, a very strongly international industry also that strives on successive waves of migrations on both sides of the Atlantic. Now let's go on to the core of our conversation today, which is indeed intellectual property. And fashion has also triggered my curiosity because it's very innovative, of course, in design. There is this idea of near perpetual renewal, which is now contested because of questions of sustainability. But fashion business is also thriving on the sewing machine, which is rather static since it was invented in the mid-19th century. And here I'd like to make a footnote to the excellent classic book by David Edgerton, The Shock of the Old. That's showing us that some innovations, the bicycle, the sewing machine, have in fact lasted very, very long. So there is this situation of fashion that's both thriving on a shock of the old with the sewing machine, and that is on the other hand, thriving on very fast renewal of novelty designs. A second important point here in the story is intellectual property rights portfolios. So I decided to not remain just with copyright, but to look at the varieties of intellectual property mobilized by entrepreneurs. Copyright, that's especially in France. I'll come back to that with a synoptic table. That's also industrial design, patent, of course, trademark, trade secrets, and then fair competition. And fair competition also shows up at some point in the story. A question was also an overarching question: how for French firms to capitalize on their creativity in worldwide markets, starting with the United States. And that's the long line of the story as well. If we remain with intellectual property rights, we have this transatlantic landscape. I can also show up that slide, show that slide again after going very quickly through a couple of lawsuits with you. In a nutshell, fashion enjoys high authorship in France. That's built on copyright and even droit d'auteur, which has a stronger component of moral right. And fashion industrialists, haute couture designers, will obtain these droit d'auteur fully acknowledged for them. This is not obvious everywhere, and especially not in the United States. The United States signed the Berne Convention in 1989, more than a century passed between French signature and American signature. But on top of that, the United States never included fashion in its copyright law. And in 2006, for example, Hillary Clinton, who was then senator of the state of New York, Hillary Clinton proposed a new bill for including fashion design in copyright law, which was not passed. And this is just one example in a very, very long story of entrepreneurs in the United States lobbying for higher authorship for fashion, but it didn't happen. So this is really at the core of the book, this asymmetry in legal protection. And that means that I've tried to see how entrepreneurs strategize around that. Because it doesn't mean that France is a nation of originators and United States is a nation of pirates. No, we have people keen on high authorship on both sides. And then we have copyists, of course, everywhere. And there can be some cat and mouse histories there that are classic and so on. But there's also the question of lobbying for or against high authorship. So now if I have the time, I don't want to eat up too much time because I like to enjoy the format of the discussion here. But a few cases, and I have put these minutes from the lawsuits that happen in a courtroom, such as this small crimes correctionnel courtroom in Paris. This is a fun one because it involves the firm on which I worked a long time ago, which was Belgian, and a French intermediary caught for counterfeiting. And here the plaintiff is a very famous fashion house that still exists today, that is Jeanne Lanvin, in the 1920s. And we have scores of such lawsuits. This is the central one in chapter 2, Madeleine Vionnet, who is suing Henriette Boudreaux. And when we see their logos here, we could think that this is a trademark case, but it wasn't. The case was waged based on copyright infringement and also industrial property, modèle déposé. So there's a combination here. It's very powerful in the French, also in other Francophone countries' laws. This combination, this ability to sue counterfeiters using both copyright and author's right in French and industrial property as a combination to obtain condemnation of so-called fashion pirates. And indeed, this was very effective, and such cases threw out of business people such as Henriette Boudreaux, who is there in the center image. So a couturier like Vionnet, very famous also in museums today, managed to eliminate quite of the competition that way. There's also the history of copying in the public eye. And here, same court book still, same proceedings. We see appearing on the right-hand side, you see here at the center, Gabrielle Chanel. I'm going to try to put a mouse there on my other screen. Gabrielle Chanel. And Chanel was very famous for always saying publicly that copying was the best form of flattery. So Chanel had this stance that she didn't care for being copied. And yet here I had the surprise to see her in these court proceedings. And she sues the same day as Vionnet. So they went together the same day in the court after the same copyist, who then had to pay damages. There was an appeal, damages were lowered, but there was still a condemnation. And we have several of these cases. And here, yes, another important point I wanted to bring to your attention is that when we think about author's right, we have this idea also of the individuality of the author, that the couturier may think of oneself as an artist. But what we see here through this case is an association of fashion professionals suing a notorious counterfeiter. So what we also see appearing through these cases in the courts is that we have collectives of fashion entrepreneurs suing one or several copyists. So it's not just a history of legitimizing an individual couturier as an artist. It's also a history of collectivities in professions. So all in all, what we see is through the 20s and the 30s that French couturiers become able to win against counterfeiters, win in these counterfeiting lawsuits. At the same time, these couturiers try to set up shop in the United States. And they meet a lot of problems in the United States during the interwar period. There they're met with business lawsuits, not about copying, but about business competition in various guises, contract problems, custom problems that are going to plague Paris couturiers trying to set up shop in the United States. This will be solved in the post-war era, when Paris couturiers do several things. They get more capital, such as Dior, allying with a French powerful industrialist Marcel Boussac, raising capital. The French couturiers at that time also stop producing only in Paris. They understand that if they want to pass muster with the American customs, they need to start producing in places just like here, this garment center capital. So they're going to delegate part of their production to American workshops. And then they will have way less problems entering the American market with their wares, because it's also a question of trade. What the French industrialists, such as Christian Dior, brilliant designer, are going to do is also to hire lawyers on the spot. Dior hires an American lawyer, Ellen Engel, who is carrying his business in the United States. And so all these elements combined with great influx of capital, and that history is narrated in chapter 5, these elements will allow French couturiers to set up shop in the United States. Now, I don't want to take further time, so I think I will go directly to my last slide. I have more in store, which is this reflection. Is fashion derivative, as the US legislator has always thought? Or is legal protection necessary, as we see in France, for the creative industries in general and for fashion in particular? That's it for now.
Okay, thank you, Veronique. Okay, over to you, Stina.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Veronique, and also thank you so much for inviting me. So you can hear me all right, and all is fine. Good. Okay. So this has been a sort of pleasurable task. It's a great book. So I was really enjoying reading it, and it sort of brings together some things that I'm very interested in, and I know that many of my colleagues are as well. Sort of this coming together of the study of business management and study of IP, and then the work of creatives, sort of bringing it all together. So I saw sort of great new, I got some great new ideas on this from reading your book, Véronique. And I also think that in a way, fashion is a sort of unexplored arena for some central developments in the 20th century. Like you were saying that you were very interested in institutions and sort of governance and things like that. And I think you also make a great case for sort of things happening or developments in the Western world, the sort of development of the welfare state and gender issues, and also the status of creative laborers. And cultural policies, trade policy, and so on. And you see it all through the lens of fashion, which is really fascinating. And then another thing that I found really sort of interesting is the subtitle. So the transatlantic fashion industry. So the whole issue of the transatlantic. So your argument, sort of roughly speaking, or I mean, you should say you've just presented it yourself, but I'm sorry if I can do my own gloss of it. Your argument is that the fashion system as we know it came into being in this dynamic interrelationship between sort of the fashion capitals of Paris and New York, and each of them representing something that has become familiar characteristics of the fashion industry and the fashion system today. And these sort of tensions between high fashion and high street fashion, and between first movers and democratic fashion, and also sort of various trend dynamics of trickle up, trickle down, and across. It all comes out in your book as something that has roots in sort of also tensions between New York and Paris. So you were saying, like just now, that this was just, I mean, there's sort of examples of dynamics. You could have talked about London or Milan, but I think there's something about the transatlantic. You also you sort of shed light on the national as an important marker in fashion, and then the importance of fashion for the branding of nations, both culturally and commercially. And then you point to this sort of reflexive character of the national modifier here. And I think, so your colleague, Kjetil Fallon and Grace Lees-Maffei, the two design historians, they sort of were also looking at this in their edited volume on Designing Worlds from 2016, where they look at sort of national design histories in the context of globalization. And then there's this phenomenon that we get our national identity by having it projected on us, is sort of one of the arguments that we see here. And I think you're making this argument as well. So for example, when I come from sort of design, more like furniture and things like that, is what I work with normally. So, but this whole notion of Scandinavian design, it didn't come into being until the US press started naming it in the mid-20th century. So suddenly all the Danish designers thought, oh gosh, there's such a thing as, it's not just design, it's Danish design. And sort of you put sort of interesting sort of new aspects onto this as well. And haute couture is sort of became what it is today in a way, in the way it was embraced by North Americans, one could say. So, and sort of just, I'm sort of like guessing a little bit here, but I think there's just one more thing I wanted to say about this sort of special relationship between New York and Paris, or North America and France. So I've always liked reading Henry James, and his whole sort of whole authorship seems to be about this sort of tension between Europe and sort of, well, New England at least, and sort of North America. But I was watching two series in the sort of long Scandinavian winter. So we streamed some series, and I was watching two series, one called Succession and one called Billions. And they're both sort of based on sort of New York City, mega rich people. And there's an episode in both of these series where the characters eat whole ortolans, sort of these little songsters. You eat them whole. And this is some sort of cruel French custom. And I've never heard a sort of French person talking about this, but it seems to be sort of a source of endless fascination. I mean, all these strange customs of the Europeans, or the sort of, at least, or the French in particular, there seems to be an endless source of fascination for North Americans. So I just wanted to add this little sort of thing to this sort of the transatlantic, because I think there's really something there. There's a sort of very productive tension. So Véronique, this was sort of my gloss on your work. And I sort of have maybe just a few more minutes, and I want to spend them on something that I'm really interested in, that I wanted to ask you about. So I think you have many interesting observations on the changing business models that are applied in fashion. And sort of you describe how sort of early 19th century female entrepreneurs changed the business models of the couturier into haute couture, and clients no longer needed to bring their own fabric, but they got sort of complete dressmaking services. And you describe how haute couture business model was fragile because it lacked the liquidities and was exposed to seasonal variations and so on. And how Dior shifted the business model of haute couture from this reliance on craftsmanship to emphasis on brand licensing and so on. And later you talk about how new technologies, including development of knitting machines, allowed for yet sort of new business models by the end of the 20th century, and fast fashion firms using IT systems, enabling fast responses to consumer demand and so on. So I think, I mean, you have say many really interesting things about sort of how we can follow the sort of adaptation of business models. So what I really want to, so we talk about the history, but I want your opinion on what do we want to place our hopes for a future business model of fashion? Because I mean, I talk to my fashion students about this, and they desperately want a new business model based in materiality and in craft, and less perhaps in the immateriality of branding. And they're also very concerned about the sustainability issues, and there's simply too much waste in the fashion system today, of what Mary Douglas called sort of, this is matter out of place. And a related question would be, what could be IP's role, if any, in supporting new business models, more sustainable business models? Because if IP captures value only if there's reproduction, so then only if we get more reproduction, then there's more value. So if those two go hand in hand only, we can only capture value if there's more dissemination and more production. But the planet doesn't need more exemplars of fashion designs. So can we have fashion without producing and disseminating more copies? So that was my question. I hope it was understandable. I was trying to speak a little fast to catch up on time, but thank you so much again for inviting me and giving me time to comment.
Thanks, Stina. We'll go to Johanna now, and then we'll come back to Veronique.
I wasn't sure if Veronique wanted to respond first, but I had a couple of different points that I wanted to follow through, but maybe if I also just quickly comment on some things raised by Stina. I do think the idea of the fashion capital is very important and very interesting, and I was particularly, I mean, I'm quite fascinated by the relationship between branding fashion capitals and the industry itself, and it's something that I do take the students through in the modules, and something that came to me because Stina was mentioning some TV shows. The way the fashion capital is used as a kind of currency in something like America's Next Top Model, where they initially started in early seasons with the sort of classic fashion capitals, Paris, Milan, etc. But then it eventually became something that they used basically to take the franchise around a whole different range of places that people mightn't have otherwise thought of. And it was actually using the currency of the fashion capital to push the America's Next Top Model franchise into other markets, into other TV markets. So I thought that was a nice little relationship between fashion and film. But something that, I mean, first on history itself, so I teach IP and fashion modules at Queen Mary, and the first thing I start out with is history, which is sometimes, I know there are students there who are thinking, why are we doing this at the beginning, but it then starts to make a lot of sense to them, and they really invest a lot in that context, and that gives them then the tools to understand some of the differences between the US and Europe, and to see how that actually has an impact on some of the questions we're thinking about, including sustainability. And one of the things that caught me when I was, the first few pages of the book, when I started reading it, was Veronique, when you referred to IP and authenticity, and how then you could trace that throughout the discussions. I think this relationship between IP and authenticity is especially important in the fashion industry. That IP is kind of used, and it's something that I've sort of been a little preoccupied with in some of my own work, is how IP is actually not just about this idea of stimulating innovation, but actually about validating cultural output. And that came through, I think, a lot in what you were in the book, and it's especially clear, it becomes quite clear in the context of fashion. So and we've been talking about branding fashion capitals and branding a national aesthetic. And that's something that I think is absolutely critical in fashion, actually deploying intellectual property in the service of developing a national taste, a national aesthetic, and then that reinforces the industry. So it's not just about the authorship, so authentically this particular author, but also about what is authentically fashion. And of course, that comes out in the discussion of utility versus art in US versus Europe. What's a valid cultural output? And I think the history is absolutely critical to understanding that different perspective, not only on fashion, but also on IP in those different jurisdictions. So then when it comes to this discussion of granting intellectual property, whether it's about generating innovation, it's also about validating the industry. And that's very relevant to contemporary debates today. And I was really pleased that Stina took us kind of thinking about how this translates into the future. So it's also about generating consumption. So not just about innovation, but actually about getting people to consume. And that is very interesting when you do compare the US and Europe, because of course the US saying, well, it's not about protecting through IP, but then they are competing on different ways. So that doesn't stop it being about reproduction. It actually accelerates reproduction. And the US industry is competing on time. So the industry outpaces the IP system. And so when you look at fast fashion, then in Europe, it's actually a similar problem. It's so much faster than the IP system that it doesn't really matter that they can, the copies can be created and sold before anything can really happen. And so and to use your phrase, so the luster of Paris as a cultural capital is really about competing on an aesthetic, competing on that authenticity. The other thing that I was also really interested in this context is then how you gave us this really incredible cultural history of the litigation and enforcement environments. So how those things were used that then took us into considering, in the fashion context specifically, how you negotiate disputes rather than just proceed to this court environment. And I think that is really important, because a lot of the discussion about IP is about more rights and competing in this sort of enforcement context, but you're actually taking us to consider more carefully the relationship between IP and contract, and this relationship between the validity of the output and the authenticity of the players themselves. So IP actually giving a tool that can somewhat paradoxically or unexpectedly contribute to keeping disputes out of the court, because there's no there's no doubt that with IP or not, fashion designers are conscious of copying, and they have an intuitive response to copying, whether or not what they understand is copying in the legal or illegal sense or what have you. So this role of IP in actually taking us beyond the banal emphasis on litigation alone and actually seeing it in these other discussions, I think is extremely insightful, and that's really sets out also why history is so important. So it's this nuanced shift in the emphasis that I really welcomed, and in particular the history of the industry's perspective on this environment. And so really looking at the kind of cultural history of the fashion industry, but also the cultural institution of IP in that context, which is something that was really particularly engaging. So I don't want to take too long, but I was so excited about too many different things. I know Kathy cautioned us that we didn't have to talk about everything, but but sort of tracing that authenticity question, the territorialities of IP, if you like, and creating the fashion capitals, and how this actually works. So you're talking about a kind of nationalism, national aesthetic, but it actually works in the sense of it's a tool to internationalizing fashion. So not seeing them as mutually exclusive, but actually seeing how those cooperate together, I think was very interesting. So that made me think about, what you were saying, how the fashion capital and branding fashion capitals also contributes to this idea of authenticity in the fashion product. So that the firm, the place, and the relationship between IP and place. And this national aesthetic, again, what you were saying about thriving with government support and so forth, it's again about recognizing fashion in that as that national tool, and creating through IP not just this idea of further innovation, but actually about creating a taste and an appetite for this national brand. So that was especially interesting, and I'd really welcome comments on how you see that link between authenticity and that consumer appetite in that context. And so taking us then into the future with sustainability, I think that IP can actually be an important tool in fashion for sustainability, because it restores the emphasis on the author. And if we're looking in the context of digital fashion, where people are scurrying to understand what happens with trademarks, I actually think what's much more important there is what's happening with copyright and design. And in many respects, it's restoring our interest in fashion as an authored work and not just a brand. So that, to me, that's very interesting. And so what you're saying, I think is actually very critical to understanding the metaverse. So I think that's probably enough from me. But my view is that yeah, so I think what comes out of that is what's very interesting about IP and this relationship to authenticity is that it can actually be a tool for sustainability. It takes us away from this overwhelming attention to time and the US model of competing on time and just creating more and more and more. It actually returns us to an interest in the author and an interest in the sustainability and resilience of a particular product. So I will leave it there. Thank you though for a great book, and thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Jo. Veronique, over to you. And if anyone has any comments or questions, please use the chat function.
Thank you very much for these very stimulating comments. It's really extraordinary to see how you read the book, what is going through and what you find is salient and so on. So really, this is really a gift. Thank you for that. There is indeed a lot I would like to comment on and reflect upon and so forth. It's quite interesting to see that these questions of nation, place, I don't think I heard terroir, but we can discuss that one as well, come back to reinvest somehow this conversation. And how even if we try to not essentialize them, which is something I've really tried really dearly to avoid doing, somehow this question comes back in different guises. So this is puzzling and interesting for me to think about. There's also somehow a sideline on the project I work on currently, including with Audrey Millet, who is here, I think, in the attendance today, which is question of made in France. And I think Audrey is carrying that on somehow also in the project as well. So there are questions there, and that includes again institutionalization, which I think is very important to really look at place institutions are playing the role of the institutions there. Now, Stina, thank you so much for being with us today, because I know you have a full agenda. So I'm going to maybe start by your very difficult question, very challenging, which is always really teasing historians to ask them to talk about the future, right? That's something as historians we try to avoid at any cost. So you've got me there. But still, maybe I have some thoughts about it that we can keep discussing. First of all, I completely agree with your students about materiality. Here at Oslo, I teach a course on history of consumption, and how over the last 10 years, students have changed in how they respond to questions on history of consumption is absolutely fascinating. And this has indeed informed the book a great deal as well, conversations with them. So I completely agree with you on materiality and our relation to materiality that's changing, including our relation to older objects. And here, in a sense, it's a sort of interesting return as well for fashion historians, which is to also look at objects. This is not a book on material culture, as you have guessed. I had to make really drastic choices at some point, because this book took me 12 years to write, and there was more material, and I made an enormous amount of cuts, which were not that painful, because I think it's very important to cut. I think this is one of the most important things we do when we try to do also longer works. So even if I left analysis of materiality out, I looked at objects. I took objects in hand. I was very lucky to access, for example, Fashion Institute of Technology's collections in New York. And the FIT is wonderful because they have a study collection. So we can also go there and really look inside of the garments, take some garments in hand and so forth. And I would really encourage anyone working on the field to do that. So materiality was important for the study, but it's also important for the future of the trade, and how discussing, for example, quality and newer studies, other scholars in the field. We had on the project a guest who is very interesting, PhD student, Sarah Cavaniero, recently, and she discussed whether labels match the materiality of the garment or not, notably with thoughts about green entrepreneurship. So these are really important questions, and I think many scholars will take them up in the future. Another important point that's also materiality is labor. And that's where I choose not to cut, because I wanted to keep labor questions within the book. Also for a disciplinary reason, which I think is that sometimes business history tends to look at management, but not necessarily at other sides of the history. And I would like to somehow preach for a more integrated history between business and labor. I think this is very fruitful somehow. So to look at labor and quality and how much labor, and of course there's this whole discussion in the media about less objects, less and better. And that's something we can support, even if it's very difficult. And it's very difficult, and that takes me to the third point I would like to offer you as an attempt of answering your questions, Tina, which is other places. Because other places, it's other markets. As Westerners, we're very, very fortunate in access to goods. But some markets are aspirational in the way they consider consumption, fashion consumption, and we cannot entirely be paternalistic there. We cannot decide everything on behalf of others. But what we can do, and I think that's something that is of high interest to me and in next projects and so forth, is to look at different places. I'll just take one example, which is a little bit extreme also, and can certainly be criticized, but it's the example of Christian Dior. You've seen his tags today, doing a wax collection using African textiles, but also crediting the makers of these textiles. So not just borrowing them. I'm not sure this alleviates all problems of co-opting designs from others and so on. There are many questions there. There are many questions of appropriation. The idea is not to say that Dior was exemplary, but to say we should, for example, look at what other places are doing. And that's one of the questions I had when finishing the book, which is why not other places? So to promote different fashion capitals, to look at different productions, but also to accept to pay a lot of money for something that is maybe made in Lagos or made in Kinshasa and not made in Paris, and to accept to also pay premium price to acquire something that will also be a beautiful object. So these are a few elements of answer to what's in the future, and these are so important questions that are also triggering consumers and media responses. I think I'll also, if I may go on with Johanna's questions, thank you very much for underlining the role of capitals. And it was really interesting to hear you saying that maybe these capitals matter too, because at some point, and that echoes the discussion back in the book, that at some point one of the reviewers at the very end said, "There's not enough about London," right? And then with the editor, we decided together, let's take out everything that's about London pretty much, right? Let's just decide radically to keep it out. And that was very helpful for me, of course, to have a stronger statement about choices in geographies there, to not try to do everything. I just have received a new book about London as capital that I'm going to review. I'm looking forward to reading it. And it's going to be interesting indeed to see how other capitals are studied. There's wonderful work about Italy, for example, that has also been very helpful for me understanding those capitals. So to see how different cities function, and Italy there too, Stina, you were evoking Grace and Chatil's work, right? Italy is also a very salient example of a successful form of marketing, a very strong nation in terms of intrinsic qualities in the production, notably. I haven't been following America's Next Top Model. I'll probably start now. Thank you for that. But indeed, there's this question of what we do with franchises, indeed, and all the celebrity culture, the media culture, and so on. I'm very happy to say that some of the project members right now, including Anna Marie, who's there, for example, today, are working on other cultural industries that allow them to really look also at celebrity culture, for example, looking at actresses, looking at musicians, looking again at women's profiles, right? At how women may develop an entrepreneurship, but also higher profiles and so forth. That appears there. And I think the limits of the book a little bit here was that it was mono industry, and that the project here is very exciting, the Creative IPR project, because it's looking comparatively at different industries, what women, for example, were able to do there. Here, I'm also thinking of Kathy's work about women in intellectual property, how they negotiate intellectual property. IP as validating cultural output, yes. Thank you, Johanna, for putting this forward in much better words that I could have. Yes, I think this is absolutely it. I very much agree with it. These negotiations that you underline, this was very important in doing the book, because one of the best sources I had was the meeting minutes of the Chambre syndicale de la couture in France, where you have an eagle eye view in the discussions of professionals. And these discussions go about labor, welfare, with tensions, of course, but also with really an idea of how do we keep talent, how do we make talent work. That's also a preoccupation. But also, how do we work with intellectual property? And here again, the game of similarities and differences between the two sides of the Atlantic work very, very well. Typically, United States entrepreneurs will take benefits from an IP lawsuit and take those benefits, those profits, those damages, take them, include them in their treasury. In France, all proceedings, damages received from intellectual property lawsuits were pooled by associations, put together, and usually used for workers' welfare. which is one of the examples of what happens with intellectual property as a business revenue, right? When we discuss negotiations. And indeed, what I've also read is this idea that negotiating is a sign of more mature practice of intellectual property, that entrepreneurs indeed will not take it to the courtroom, but will try to find other ways. Sometimes the negotiation will be also a way to go out of the courtroom. We have cases like with Dior that last for several years. Some of the plaintiffs even die along the way, and then eventually the remaining actors will eventually negotiate something. Also a little bit in a way to not lose face for entrepreneurs, because these are sometimes industry heavyweights. So there's that aspect too. But indeed, I think not just doing the research in the courtroom, not just this most adversarial manifestation, but also looking at how entrepreneurs function together is really important, looking at entrepreneurial ecosystem. So thank you very much for raising that point. About the metaverse, this is also a question about the future, and this is a fun one, because I've looked at these disputes about the Hermès Birkin bag and the fact that the metaverse is supposed to be somehow immune for copyright, but it's not, because firms now decide that they have to sue if they see a Birkin appearing in the metaverse that has not been validated by the mothership Hermès. So there is place for disputes there. There's also questions of the traction of the metaverse object. That's something I'm really very curious of and very dubious of, because one of the elements that came through here too, also with Stina's questions and so forth, is the quality of the object and also the pleasure from the high quality objects. And I don't know how the metaverse is going to negotiate that, or if the metaverse will become another iteration of the Bitcoin, shall we say. So there's all the speculative elements, and it's really odd. At the same time, we see, of course, that the speculative element in secondhand luxury goods is becoming higher and higher, which in terms of sustainability is very reassuring, right? To think that an old Birkin, an old Chanel 255 or whatsoever will retain, but also even augment value. If we look at it from the vantage point of sustainability, this has something rather nice. But now, is the metaverse able to compete? No. Is it able to speculate? Yes. Authenticity there is a question again that's going to be reconducted differently. I'm equally curious.
Yeah, it's interesting, even something like Gucci Vault, where they're trying to match the archive concept and the classic designs with digital products, and having people engage and you know, experience that archive, but through the digital product is sort of, it has interesting resonances with what you're saying and looking at, I think. Yeah.
Can I jump in with a comment on about that? And if anybody else has any questions, please let me know too. But one of the things that I thought reading the book, and also in this discussion about the validation of cultural output and authenticity, has got something to do with the reality of selling luxury goods, because luxury goods do actually still come from somewhere, and they have links with ancient regimes, artisanal labor and things, which really I found a really interesting part of your book that I kept coming back to it. Like, you know, Paris as a city is very present right throughout the narrative of all your chapters, because it's something which is so opposed to, I guess, all the symbolism and all the structures of American modernism. And so it's got something, and, you know, and it also relates to your comments in the book about American fashion, that it actually struggles to actually find its identity as actually having, you know, haute couture designers and things like that. And I think there is something there about the resonance of Europe and Paris as a city and its cultural significance. And you're observations about cultural heritage. So I guess it's not really a question, but basically whether or not you would link some of that to what is distinctive about luxury goods as opposed to just fashion itself.
Thank you, Kathy, for raising that point. Indeed, I mean, an idea was to look at the courtroom and the strategies there, but the wider ecosystem is equally important. And that means the cultural landscape, the city landscape itself. This idea, we find Walter Benjamin and so on discussing Paris as capital of the 19th century. This has completely buttressed the industry, plus the ecosystems around with high quality silk, high quality cottons, fabrics, laces. There are many regions around that are also supporting that ecosystem. And that's also an important history. There are several colleagues in France who are doing remarkable work about that. So that resonance is indeed historical in the production. There's this question of terroir that's discussed with great interest about wines and foods. That certainly has its own vantage point here. There's the question of labor and quality of labor as well that keeps being discussed. At the same time, what fascinated me is that I was lucky to spend a little bit of time in the US when working on the book. And I started looking a little bit more closely at American designers. And at that time, I really marveled at some of these American design innovations and thought there was indeed extraordinary talent there. But that talent somehow suffered from an image problem as well. And I think this is the other side of the coin. That's the producers that are in the shadow and remain in the shadow. And that's a question if we want producers situated in southernmost countries, for example, to emerge, we also have to interrogate ourselves about how to emerge shining as a designer, right? What to do when this aura of a capital is not present. I'm not saying this has to be solved in the courtrooms, not at all, but that's also a question that I had maybe even more on the back of my mind when I was doing the book, which was, all right, why is there some talent that gets so little spotlight? And I think, for example, American designers like Claire McCardell, Elizabeth House, who really, really suffered getting through. Elizabeth House tried to show in Paris and she received cold shoulder. She felt really completely disgruntled and went back to the US to get on with her business. So that's also the idea of this aura of Paris-based designers, so strong that it also, in a sense, creates an advantage, a very strong competitive advantage for the ones based there and a disadvantage for others, possibly. Raising many also questions to this day. But thank you for pointing out that.
We are on time. Has anybody got something they'd like to add or a comment?
I also would like to add, if someone would like to receive a copy of the book, this is also an occasion. Please don't hesitate. I have a couple spare copies and I'm very happy to ship one or two to colleagues who would like a copy.
That's very, very generous of you. Okay, well, we might wind it up here then. Thank you very much for our participants and particularly for Véronique for her fantastic book and for a really stimulating discussion. We hope to see you all at other ISHTIP events in the future and have a good evening.